Welcome to the PetroPapers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yoshi Pradhan, and with me here today, I have Brian Sullivan from the University of Texas. Hook 'em. In this season, instead of talking about papers, we're going to talk about people, learn about their career trajectories, and understand what kind of technical advice they can give to our listeners in order to make contributions to our industry. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to go ahead and get started with it. How'd you get here, Professor Sullivan? Tell us about your career path.
Well, I thought about that, and as my wife reminded me this morning, it's an odd path. My dad he passed away recently, but my dad was an engineer's engineer, and he went to work for Shell Oil Company, and we were referred to as Shell brats because we moved every 3 years, whether we needed to or not. So I got to live in California, New York, Baton Rouge, Houston. But I was always an engineer. I was always good at solving math problems, always pretty good in science. And even though my high school counselor, who I met with for a total of 5 minutes, told me I should go to A&M or Texas and become an accountant, the University of Texas sent me a scholarship offer in petroleum engineering. And I thought, well, the first 2 years of engineering were all the same. And, my dad's a chemical engineer. I'll just see how I like it. Well, I joined petroleum engineering and I loved it. It was wonderful. I still have fabulous friends from people I met in 1972 in the very first class. We get together. It's been wonderful. So, but I always knew I wanted to go to law school. And, you need to have good grades to go to law school. And I really didn't feel like other majors, I would have such good grades. The other thing is, at the time, if you were an engineering student, it was viewed as a harder major. So most law schools actually bumped your grade point average when compared to other majors. So worked all my summers out in the field, loved it, worked for Amoco Production Company as an engineer, and then went to law school. And while I was in law school, I worked for a consulting engineer. And I found a niche where petroleum engineering and law go together. And that is basically in the regulation of oil and gas. And so when I graduated from law school, I went to work for the Texas Railroad Commission as an administrative law judge, where I was both a lawyer and a technical examiner, and did that for a couple of years, was counsel to one of the commissioners who was elected, and then left and essentially started my own practice with a couple of other people in about 1982, and had a good long 40 plus year run. And I just decided to retire after that time and go to work. I'm retired and I work for the university a little bit teaching, and then I help out at my old law firm.
Awesome. Could you talk about some of your inflection points and how you pursued growth? What are some key points in your life or in your career that help you grow?
Sure. One of the best things about having gone to work for the Texas Railroad Commission was that you were given an enormous amount of responsibility at a very young age. At 24, I am a judge deciding cases, which was, it's amazing to be given that kind of responsibility. But from a growth perspective, everybody who has any business in Texas has to come through the Railroad Commission. And so I spent all this time hearing from engineers, geologists, landmen, lawyers, arguing their cases. but almost always they were putting on evidence of the latest engineering developments or calculations that they were using to develop their fields. So one of the great things for me is that my whole career has been continuing engineering education, because I listened to all of the engineers, and when there were fights between engineers over who was correct, I would ultimately have to resolve that issue. So it made me a better analyst of engineers' work, so that I would go through and figure out, okay, which of these two engineers is likely correct? And that was very helpful. Then when I left state employment and started my own firm, when I had cases before the commission, and ultimately I had over 1,000, I would be putting on engineers and geologists as expert witnesses. But part of your job as a lawyer is to make sure that their testimony is valid and that it is more likely to be adopted by the judge than the other side. And so what I viewed part of my job, given that I have an engineering background, part of my job really was to prepare these people to testify, but also to learn everything that they knew about what they were going to testify to, so that I could pick holes in it before they actually testified. And most of the time, the lawyers I worked with, we were able to tell somebody what they were likely to be cross-examined on. And so if we did our job, we made all of their testimony and all of their technical work consistent. And that was really something I liked doing a lot, but it meant that every day, every engineer who comes in is going to teach me something I didn't know. And so working through 40 years, it's been fun to look at, when we started, people were talking about the black oil model, the BOSS reservoir simulation model. Well, nobody would touch that today, because you've got all of these new and better ways of doing things. But I had to learn how to pick it apart so that people would know how to testify and how to defend themselves. So for me, it was great all the way through.
That's awesome. That's very interesting you mentioned that, in terms of the preparation and being a step ahead of the engineers.
Yeah, one of the things I wish I could do more in my class was that I had 1 year before I retired, we had a large hearing at the Railroad Commission, lots going on. Well, that afternoon I had class, so I just had my expert witnesses come to class that day, and we did the entire presentation before the class. And at the end of the year, when I looked at the reviews, that was one of the things they thought was most interesting, was how an engineer or a geologist makes a presentation of technical data to a judge. So anyways, it was a lot of fun to do that.
That's excellent. Speaking of your class, I was meaning to ask you another question about it. What inspired you to teach what you're teaching, and what have been some impactful takeaways for the students? I know you touched upon it a little bit in terms of that particular experience, but what have been some other takeaways that students have gotten from your class?
Well, the class, John Olson and I talked about it for a while. And back when I was an undergraduate, there was this very class. There was an oil and gas law class. And the professor who taught it passed away. And so, years went by, and John and I talked about doing it. So I set up a class to do it. But what I did was I went to most of the oil companies I represented, usually like vice president of land, vice president of engineering, a couple of presidents, and said, okay, I'm going to teach this class. what is it a petroleum engineer graduating from the University of Texas doesn't know about oil and gas law and regulation when they show up in your class, at your office? And I got pages and pages of material saying, here are all the things we wish they knew. Okay. So the class completely evolved out of that. So we do ownership, because how you own oil and gas is different depending on the state you're in, country you're in, what you have to do to develop it, the different rights that people have. And so we go through all of that in regulation, but it's clear that the most fun part for them is at the end, we talk about oil and gas transactions, basically doing deals. And I've been had such good luck with younger, though not always, petroleum engineers like, say, a Matt Gallagher, who was the president of Parsley Energy in Austin, now has his own firm, Green Lake, I think. Coming back and saying, teaching the students about how it is you make a deal, how it is you get into the oil and gas business. And it's not always that you go to work for a big oil company. I mean, that's one thing, of course, and it's a very good thing. But over time, you may want to involve yourself more in the business end of it. You may want to drill your own prospects, produce your own wells, buy production. So for the last several classes, what we'll do is talk about traditional deal structures, bring in an investment banker from an oil and gas perspective who will talk about how investment banks get involved in oil and gas transactions. And that and I noticed this last year, what I did was I gave the students, I paired them up, and they had a choice. They could either take their final exam, or they could be paired up where it was 2 against 2. And I gave them, you are a landowner, you have a sister who's a ne'er-do-well and spends all the family money, you have this ranch you want to lease, you've got this debt, and then gave them about 10 days to negotiate. One side was the oil company buying the lease, other side were the landowners, and then they had to negotiate a joint operating agreement to actually bring the project forward. And it was fun. I told them that nobody can get an A if you don't make a deal. So A's off the table. You have to find a way to make a deal. And they all did. But what came of it was that I let them watch each other's presentations, and nobody did it the same way. And the whole point of the exercise was that there's an infinite number of ways to get this done. And they mirrored that. It was wonderful. So anyways, that's the whole theory behind the class. What they're learning is they're learning a language, which is oil and gas law, and how things actually work when they get out in industry. And it's been fun. The students are just fabulous.
Awesome. I know I told you this offline, but I wish I took your class when I was at UT. I wish I really did, because there was so much I did not know about land, so much I did not know about oil and gas law that I had to learn on the job. And it's so underrated, in my opinion, because a newly minted engineer focuses so much on technical stuff.
Yep.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because this is just as important, if not more, in terms of how to even get your operations to start to begin with, how to even allow what you're even doing, the technical work that you can even do. So,
well, I've had one other valuable resource. I have 2 nephews who are both petroleum engineers. So they're at your age and stage. and I see them regularly, and I'm always asking them, okay, what is it I should add? And I'm getting to the point where after 5 years now, the students that I've taught have started coming back and saying, hey, this was really useful, and this maybe not so much. And so hopefully I'll be able to continue to steer it toward what you all are seeing as you get out and graduate.
Absolutely. The other question I wanted to ask is just what are some advice you can give to our listeners in making contributions to the industry in terms of how to get more involved and in terms of how to even get the exposure of making deals and getting in other than taking the class?
Yeah. As you progress, at least in my experience, you're going to get more exposure to that. I mean, you're doing probably, if it hasn't changed that much, you're probably doing a lot of economic work, about how projects are they going to pay out? Are they going to meet our requirements to be invested in? But stay involved in that. If you're making a presentation, see if you can stay involved in where it goes. One of the things I really didn't like when I was a production engineer was I'd make a presentation to my boss and he'd say, okay, yes, I approve that. He'd sign it, and then I'd never see it again, right? I never saw the implementation. So to the extent you can stay involved in that, you're going to see all the other aspects. You're going to see the problems with the trade. If the landmen or the executives are trying to make some sort of a deal, to the extent that they'll allow you just even to hang around, that's really good. I've also seen one of the speakers, and once again, it's Matt Gallagher, who's just a superstar. He said one of the things that happened to him as a petroleum engineer was that he got asked to help the business people. And really, he was more or less just an explainer. Here's what we're doing technically. Let me, because the business people wanted to know enough to start negotiating. And as a result of that, he went to New York, where they would discuss projects and funding. And so that kind of thing, if you can sort of get pushed into the business end of it a little bit, it's very helpful. You'll see the bigger picture, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that advice. There's one more question I wanted to ask before I let you go.
Okay.
And is what motivates you to solve oil and gas problems?
I thought about that because that was the hardest question. I mean, anybody who's an engineer likes to solve problems. I mean, now that I'm retired, I do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day. I've got to have a puzzle to solve. But I think overall, it's just moving the ball forward. When you solve a problem, you're moving the ball forward in some way, and that just feels good. It feels like you've made a contribution. So to me, if you've got the mindset that you want to solve a problem, then you're really improving things when you do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, Professor Sullivan.
Thank you. And I look forward to meeting you in person in November.
Absolutely. Well, folks, feel free to reach out to Brian Sullivan through his LinkedIn or through the UT website on his profile. This is Yoshi Pradhan, and we're signing off.